Charlie Shea's story. Charlie had a photograph that he thought a lot of, and so he had it, it wasn't in very good shape. So he had it digitally enhanced, and he had it in his house, and he wanted it fixed for display, the Pompey Historical Fabius.
That's okay.
Fabius Historical Society, and he knew exactly how he wanted it displayed. He knew exactly what he wanted to say about it. So he gave it all to me. He just gave me a sketch about how it was supposed to look, and I did it, and I took it back to him, and he said, "Now, you sit right down there and don't talk." And he took it up, and he looked at it and made sure I hadn't disarranged it. And then he read every single word to make sure that I hadn't changed anything. And after this all finished, I said something to him, and he said, "No, you take it home and give it, it's going to be given at a meeting of the Historical Society." So I'm here today with a picture of the first plane to land in Fabius. And he wrote about it. I'll give you the support. He wrote what he knew about it here and what he found out about the plane. And I can tell you that the digital enhancement of this is an incredible thing. I've watched my daughter do it, and Michelle Omar, who did this at Industrial Color Lab, remembers it vividly because it is an incredible thing. Charlie wanted you to have this to display, this so you know where it came from, and an additional copy. Who knows what? I was just going to say, when I look at this, I realize that this picture was taken at absolutely the last possible moment. The pilot has his leather helmet on and goggles, and he's climbing into the plane.
What year was that?
What year does Charlie say it was? 1925.
Wow.
And it's on the corner where his uncle lived, on the corner of Vincent Corder's Road and Route 80. Believe me, everything you need to know is right there.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank Charlie.
Yes. Okay, is there any other new business? Okay, this meeting is adjourned, and now Chuck Butcher will talk to you. And when he's back.
Language. It's not German, it's not Russian, it's not English, it's not French. It's an Indo-European language of which there are only two spoken nationalities, Latvian and Lithuanian. No other language in the world has any similarity or any basis to this too. So let me just, I was hoping for an easel. It says, Sveiki, paldies, ka atnācāt šodien manu runu noklausīties. Ceru, ka jums šīs stāsti būs interesanti. Rakstīts latviskā valodā.
You better move to the mic for that one. You gotta read it again.
Well, I've read it. I've read it.
Don't say it again.
Say it again.
Okay.
In the mic.
Sveiki, paldies, ka atnācāt šodien manu runu noklausīties. Thank you for coming today to listen to my speech. Cercajum šiestāstibūs interesanti. I hope that my stories will be interesting to you. And this is rakstīts latviskā valodā. This is written in Latvian language. So,
It's all phonetic.
It's a
now
phonetic
we can erase that.
You gotta use the mic. You gotta use the mic.
You're not hearing it all?
Disconnect it, hear, take the mic off, or hand take the mic off.
Can he carry it or not?
It comes
Can he walk around with it?
Okay.
Put it up there.
I don't like this thing because sometimes I end up biting it. Let me just ask you one question. Is anybody here, well, I shouldn't say this, is anybody here old enough to have been in the military service during World War II? One? I know you were not in Germany, were you?
After the war, I was.
After the war, okay. Because here's an interesting little story. My brother-in-law asked me to give his church a speech or dissertation, shall we say, in Cleveland during the 4th of July a couple of years ago. And I was telling the congregation about where we were and what the war was all about. And I was describing the different cities that we were going to. And when I mentioned the word Wasserburg, this one guy jumped up and he says, "Hey, I know, I was there when the war ended, Wasserburg." And he starts describing this little German town in Bavaria. And he says, "You know, the river goes like this and then it turns around and comes right back." And I said, "Yep, that's Wasserburg." So he had tears in his eyes. He says, "I can't believe that, you know, somebody else was there when the war ended." And we were there at the time when the war ended. When I say we, it's...
Out of mercy.
Not gonna leave you alone.
Tip it in, so it's a little under.
You're not hearing it in the back?
You got it.
Now you are, right?
You got it.
Okay. So it's one of these coincidences where
Hold the mic up.
you never expect anybody to know about a little town at the end of the war, but that was the day when the American troops took over the area where we were staying. But let me back up and let's go back to Latvia. Latvians have been in that area probably for 2,000 to 3,000 years. I think the mention is 2,000 or 3,000 BC.
Yeah.
Archaeologically speaking, they have found Roman coins in the various locations. So the trade has been extensive with the rest of the world. They have always been there, and there's never been more than 2 million Latvians at any one particular time. They may have gone up to 2.5 million, but World War I came along and it dropped back down to 2 million. World War II came along, and again, 200,000 or 300,000 Latvians dispersed, were deported, were executed. So right now, there's about 2 million Latvians in the country, which since 1991 has again regained its freedom from the Soviet Union. It was free and independent from 1918 to 1940. And those were frequently referred to by the Latvians as the good years, because the economy was booming, manufacturing was going on, and education was doing well, trade was going well with England and with Germany and with other countries in Europe. And then we found out afterwards that in 1939, while everything was still reasonably peaceful in Europe, Hitler and Stalin had come together with a secret agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which in a sense agreed that part of Europe would be divided. The eastern part would be given over to the Russians, and the western part would be given over to the Germans, and neither side would contest the other ones taking over. So as a result of this Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, half of Poland, and Finland, I believe, was to be turned over to the Russian sphere, and the western part of Poland and southern Germany, and southern Europe, the Germans would take over. So having agreed on the division of Europe, the the two superpowers decided, okay, we're going to start rearming ourselves. And here's the interesting part. Stalin was so in agreement with Hitler, and he admired him. And when there were Russian spies in Germany who were sending word back to Stalin saying, don't trust the Germans, they are going to be attacking you. Stalin said, no, these are lies perpetrated by the British. I trust the Germans, nothing is going to happen. So for 2 or 3 years afterwards, after this agreement, there was a lot of trade and agreement, and this gave the Russians the opportunity to force diplomatically their will on Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, knowing that the Germans would say nothing contrary to that. So in 1939, Stalin asked the foreign ministers of all those countries to come to Moscow and sign a non-aggression pact non-aggression pact treaty. Now, there's probably between 100 and 150 million Russians, and there's 2 million Latvians. What kind of an aggression can the Russians expect out of 2 million people? Hardly anything at all. But the agreement had to be signed, and Stalin told his foreign minister, if you don't get this agreement from the Latvians and Lithuanians, don't let these ambassadors or foreign ministers leave Moscow until the agreement is signed. So the agreement, in a sense, said, we want Russian troops stationed in the Baltic states. We want the airports, we want the naval bases, and the Latvians tried to say, well, we're not going to be attacking. What is the need for it? And the argument on the Russian side was, we want this thing, and if you don't want it, we're going to take it over anyways. So they came in 1940, and 1940-41 proceeded to become what is known as the Year of Terror, where secret lists were made of people who were to be eliminated from the Latvian society. And these lists were the intelligentsia, who mostly would be like opinion formers, Boy Scout leaders, Girl Scout leaders, clergies, university professors, government leaders, agricultural leaders, anybody who had a sense of identity would be picked up, and this all happened on the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th of June, 1941. There's a story about the knock on the door late at night. You open the door, there are a couple of Russian soldiers with their bayonets, and they say, you have 5 minutes to put something in the suitcase and come with us. That's how quickly and how, shall we say, inhumanly the situation was handled. In some instances, the list consisted of an entire family. In other situations, it was only a mother or a father, and the Russians simply went by the list. If you're not on the list, the kids stay behind, the mother and father is going to be arrested. In order to do this arrest as promptly as possible, the Russians brought in 490 railroad cars, 490 cattle cars in various Latvian railroad stations. They were all distributed. Okay, you're going to get so many stations, so many cars, therefore you're going to have 1,000 people. 14 or 15,000 people were deported to Siberia in 2 days. Now this is overnight. There were long trains going to Siberia. Quite a few of these people, this was in the middle of summer. The further east you go in Russia, the warmer it gets because further away from the moderate temperatures. So quite a few of these people, not being used to the heat and the humidity and the lack of water and sanitarian conditions, died on the trains, in which case the trains would periodically stop, the doors would open up, and the Russians say, anybody dead, throw them out. So the Russian philosophy was a little bit different from the German philosophy. The Russians said, well, why don't we work these people to death? We don't want to just shoot them right away. Why don't we take them to Siberia where they can be building bridges, working in coal mines, clearing forests, and then when they're exhausted, then, you know, if they die, that's okay. The German philosophy soon afterwards was, well, let's put them in concentration camps, and you know what happened there. So this is 1941. Yeah, a couple of days, or about a week after the, thank you, about a week after this mass deportation and to Siberia, Germany attacked Russia. This was a complete surprise to Stalin, because he really did not expect that the agreement between the two of them would be broken. So Germany quickly ran through the Baltic states up to where Leningrad is. And if you know history, you're aware of the fact that Leningrad was being surrounded by the German troops, I think, for almost 3 years, where the Russians did not give in or give up, but the city was surrounded by Germans. And all of these German troops had to come through Latvia in order to get up there to north of Estonia. So in the meantime, the Latvians had lost all opportunity for any self-government. The Germans said, no, you do not have the opportunity, you will not be allowed to form any government of your own, even though when the Germans first came in, the Latvians were saying, oh my goodness, this is great, you know, we've been rescued from the Russians. But they soon found out that, you know, and so the philosophy was started, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If you think about it, you know, which is the worst of the two enemies? Well, the Latvians were not allowed any self-government, and when the Germany started losing in 1943, the Hitler government decided, well, we need all the troops we can get. Now we're going to tell the Latvians that they can start forming their own army to protect their own country. Unknown to all of the Latvians was the fact that the Germans had already planned for the Baltic states. In their philosophy, as soon as we win the war, all of the people from the Baltic states are going to be forced into Russia, and the Baltic areas are going to be taken over and become German provinces. We're going to send in Germans into the Baltic states. It's great climate, it's good agricultural, good manufacturing, so let's just displace a couple of million people from each country. North of Latvia is Estonia. They almost had 2 million people. South of Latvia is Lithuania. They have a little bit more than 2 million people. All of these were going to be replaced and sent to Germany, sent to Russia by the Germans. Obviously, this did not work out. So, going back a little bit more, let me ask you a question. If you knew that you had 5 or 10 minutes to get ready, what would you take along? How would you prepare? What would be the important thing for you to take in order to survive, in order to be able to carry something? Well, what happened was later on, when my parents decided that it was time to try to escape out of Latvia, which was under German occupation, my parents took their cameras, their diplomas, their paperwork, documentation, certifications, and a couple of books. That's the only thing that they could carry, and yet they would be able to get on a train.
And a few pictures.
And that's right, and a few pictures.
Some precious photos.
What I have done with the help of my sister and also Sue, is I've taken some of these old photos from my parents, and we made copies, and underneath it we've written information on what the pictures are all about, and I'm going to pass them around. What? No? Now the question is, I have a lot of photos, and if I start passing them around, I may have trouble keeping up with the story as the photos are going along. So let me finish more.
What about you?
Yes.
What about me?
you?
Start talking about
Your family.
What about the children? Your parents are taking these documentations.
Right.
What about you, the children?
Are you all
Well, I
old?
was 9 years old when we left Latvia, and my sister was 6 years old. And we escaped with my grandmother. And the story was that my grandfather, who owned a brick factory in the country, tried to go back to the brick factory the night before the train was supposed to leave the capital city of Riga, and he never made it back to where we were supposed to meet him. So we never met him again. And the reason why is that he wanted to make sure that he goes back to the factory and tells the people who work there that, hey, the war is almost upon us. I'm no longer in charge. You know, do what you have to do to save yourselves. So, along with that, just see, I'm bouncing back and forth with these stories. Before the war was almost lost by the Germans, and we were still under German occupation, we were trying to make it back to the countryside where the brick factory was, and by that time all of the trains had stopped and the cars had been confiscated. So we were on a wagon being pulled by horses, going back to the country, and it was on a country road, and there's a guy coming towards us, and he says, there are 3 dead German soldiers ahead of you in the ditch. Do not show any interest, do not show any sympathy to them. In fact, he says, if you want to do it, spit in their direction, because you are being observed by a band of Russian guerrillas who have crossed the river, and they've killed these German soldiers, and they want to see how the locals respond to dead Germans on the roadside. So do not indicate any sympathy, and you'll be okay. So we went by, and I remember seeing one, maybe part of another German in the ditch there, but you know, we were told, keep on going, don't try to see if they're wounded or dead, just keep on going, because I think the guy said they were dead. So, let me see where we are.
Hey, Peter,
What?
introduce your family, because your father,
Okay.
being trained as a doctor, might have been tempted to stop and try to help an injured
Right.
person.
Okay, one of the lucky reasons why we ended up getting out as readily as we were was the fact that my father was a doctor, and if there's ever a time in the wartime, whenever there's a time for a doctor, it's during the wartime. So he was able to talk to the Germans and get the Germans to agree to let us on a ship to leave Latvia in October of 1944, and then we were able to well, he was able to get a job in Germany as a doctor. My mother, unfortunately, only had a mathematics degree, but my father said, oh, she's a nurse. So the Germans said, oh, okay, a doctor and a nurse, we want these people. So we in a sense, got the agreement or the permission to board a German hospital ship in October of 1944. And my father said, you need a doctor on the ship? And they said, yes, come aboard. And my father said, well, we're traveling with another family, and we want to be staying together. So the Germans said, okay, get the other people aboard too. And here's the mystery. My father kept referring to that ship as the Gotland. In the history books, there is a story about a German hospital ship called the Gottlieb that was sunk by the Russian submarines in the Baltic Sea in January 1945 with a loss of over 4,000 or 5,000 people. It was the winter time, and even though that there were some other ships that tried to rescue them, when it's freezing, when it's the freezing water in the middle of the night, very few were rescued, and even some of those who were rescued died afterwards. I never found out, and I'm not sure, if the ship that we were on was the one that went back a second time and was torpedoed. My father kept referring to a ship called Gotland. In the history books, it's Gottlieb. Did my father mispronounce? That, you know, this is one of those mysteries that I have not been able to solve. Okay, before we get ourselves into Germany, let me just describe the situation in Latvia. In 1939 and 1940, when the Russians came in and the deportations started, people were, in a sense, spied upon constantly. If they had a telephone, you knew that the telephone was going to be bugged. If you went someplace and met somebody, you never wanted to talk loud because you never knew whether or not somebody sitting next to us or at another table was a communist spy. So this became a kind of a society of seclusion. You didn't want to say anything to anybody because it wasn't going to be safe. I apologize for jumping back and forth. We took the ship, the Gotland, from Ventspils, Latvia, to Danzig, which is nowadays called Gdansk in Poland. From there, my sister was very helpful in looking at the maps, and she drew a map of where we were. We left Latvia here, and this is our travel through Poland, Germany, into Austria. The reason why we left Germany is because there was so much bombing going on in 1944 that it was lucky we were still alive. And the reasons why we went to Austria is the person who took care of the apartment house in Riga.
I'll just pass it along.
Okay. The person who was in charge of taking care of the apartment house was a World War I POW whose family had come from Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was captured by the Russians. And after the war, when most of the Austro-Hungarians were allowed to go back home after World War I, he decided to stay in Latvia. He liked it, he married a Latvian, and we got along, my parents got along quite well with him. He was older, and he said, I know the war is coming, but I really don't think that I'm young enough to go back and make the run again. I'm going to stay here and see what happens. He says, but if you want to go to Germany, we can give you an address of my family or my relatives in southern Austria that would be able to take care of you and help you. So we had an address of southern Austria, of a German family, Austrian family, that we never knew. But this guy was kind enough to say, hey, they'll take care of you. So here we were, you got the picture there. We were in the Ruhr, where it was being bombed almost daily by the Americans and by the British.
Peter,
And
Peter, can I ask a question?
I mean,
Peter, when you fled the country there, was your family fleeing the Russians or the fact that the front was approaching your country, or why did they flee?
the main reason why almost 200,000 Latvians left Latvia in 1944 and 45 was the fear of the Russians coming back a second time. When they realized what had been done to the Latvians in 1941, there was, the other story about
What the
that.
Germans did wasn't as bad as what the
The
Russians.
Germans were not as bad in the beginning, but when they came in, after a while, they made sure that every Latvian Jew was captured and either sent to Siberia, either sent to German concentration camps, and the Germans also set up a concentration camp near Riga. Also, people who spoke against the German presence disappeared under the German rule. But like I said, the enemy of your enemy is my friend, whatever. We felt, or my parents felt, and most of the Latvians felt, that it would be better to take a chance on living in Germany than being sent to Siberia, because we found out afterwards that there was one list in 1941 that was being rounded up and sent to Siberia. There was a second list of also people of Latvian origin that was to be picked up later on. Well, the Germans attacked a week later on, and therefore the second list was never activated. So not knowing what list we were on, it was a case of getting out of there. Okay, one other reason why we definitely wanted to leave is my mother, part of the time, employed a lady as a housekeeper, and that lady would also take me for rides in the park and so forth. It was like a babysitter. This lady, it turned out, was half Russian, half Latvian, and she had been a member of the underground Communist Party in Latvia, and she came up to my parents soon after the initial deportation, and she said, "You also have a home in the country. May I suggest that you and your family go to the country while this thing is going on?" In a sense, she knew, she implied without saying that it's best for you not to be in Riga. This was all Riga, the capital city. The capital city of Riga probably has a quarter of the entire population. And if there's 2 million people in the entire country, Riga, and metropolitan Riga, probably has 400,000 or 500,000 people. So it's that kind of a relationship. And the place where we ended up to escape was down here, where my grandfather had a brick factory. I'd be better off if I could send some of this information around here. Well, anyways, so to answer your question, we felt that going to Germany would be also risky, but it would be better than trying to live under Soviet rule, because we had already experienced some of that.
Slightly better.
Pardon me?
It was slightly better.
Slightly better,
Slightly
right?
better.
Yeah.
So, but when you fled, though, everybody realized the Germans were losing, and it eventually.
Oh yes.
No question about it.
Let me.
Send some
We took the train to this port city here, Ventspils, and soon afterwards the Russian army came and reached the Baltic Sea, cutting this part of Courland off. So there was no way of anybody making it to Germany on land. The only way to do it now was to try to get across by the boats. And this is where the Russian submarines were picking off a lot of the German ships. So we made it out from here to Gdansk in Poland. Once we got to Austria, everything was peaceful. We had a partial house in the Alps, and my father was one of these people who would constantly keep track of where the front is, where the war is, how are the front news coming along, which army is advancing, and he kept looking at the maps and he was saying, the Russians are advancing faster into Austria than the American army is going to be making into Austria from the west. So he said, even though it's peaceful now, it's best for us to try to get out of Austria and back into southern Germany, where he felt the American army would be most likely to occupy and keep the area, which again turned out to be true. Now here's a little incident. Even though the Germans had taken over Austria, trying to get back out of Austria, back into Germany, was difficult because once you got to the border, the German border guards would say, well, you're not German, you're Latvian, we don't want you back in Latvia, we don't want you back in Germany, you're going to have to stay in Austria. Luckily, we were traveling with another Latvian family, and this lady spoke perfect German, and she happened to have, she must have known what she was doing, she happened to have a suitcase half filled with liquor bottles. No matter what time of the war it is, you know, when somebody's offered a liquor bottle, all of a sudden the smile comes on the border guard's face, and he says, "Oh, yes, you sound like you're German. Please go ahead. You can come back into Germany." So it helps to. It doesn't necessarily help to drink, but it sure helps to have liquor around. So we were back in Germany, in southern Germany, and this is when I mentioned about Wasserburg. That was the town that we were approaching when the American Army took over. And I was standing on a little hilltop by a German, I don't know if it was a machine gun nest or a mortar position. The German soldiers were there, and they were showing me the stuff, and the Germans were saying to me, now our information, our intelligence is that the American Army will be appearing tomorrow morning around the bend by the river. So the Germans were telling me, we are not going to fire back. The war is over. We are here. When the Americans come, we're just going to give up, and the war will be done. He said, but to make sure, do not be up here by this machine gun nest tomorrow morning, because we don't want to take a chance on you getting killed. And so this is where this guy in Cleveland jumps up and says, yes, I was there, I was coming across the river. Small world. Now, from there, like I said, what? Oh. I'm very informal. I keep looking at
I'm
things.
just checking to see if I
Oh,
can hear
okay.
you back here.
Now, we were still refugees. There were about 1 million refugees in Western Germany by this time. Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Hungarians, whatever you have, were milling around, not knowing what's going to happen. Luckily, most of these people were in the American zone, and the American Army had enough food after the war to supply the displaced person camps or refugee camps. And so, based upon your nationality, people were placed in different camps, and these nationalities were given the opportunity to start their own government, you know, have your own church service, have your own choirs, and have your own schools. Luckily for me, most of the people that were starting the schools in this little town called Mildorf were high school and college professors from Latvia that had escaped. So what better opportunity for these people to give you a super duper education is by having a 6th grader or a 7th grader as their pupils. In 6th or 7th grade in Latvian schools, I was exposed to geometry, algebra, chemistry, physics, and English language and German language and Latvian literature. Stepping a little bit forward, just before I go back, when we came to Boston, and I'll go back to the reason why, when we came to Boston, the Boston Education Department said, oh, you come from Europe, your education probably must have been so bad that we're going to put you back a grade. Instead of the 7th grade as you were, you're going to have to start all over in 6th grade in Boston. You know, my exposure in 6th grade in Boston was sitting in class and listening to a teacher reading a book to us. It was fantastic. It was such a contrast between getting a sophisticated education in the Latvian language and being read to in Boston. Okay. how do we get out of Germany? In 1949 and 1950, under President Truman's instructions or decree, any political refugee from Germany could apply to come to the United States if he had a sponsor. You had to have somebody in the States who would sponsor you and your family and guarantee you not only a place to live, but subsistence and also the opportunity of getting a job. Now, my father knew a guy who had come to Boston in 1949, so this Latvian minister who knew my father got in touch with a retired dentist's widow, and she sponsored us, the whole family, not knowing much about us, but she was convinced by the friend of my father's that we would be a good family to sponsor. So here we are in Boston, and she takes my father, to the Massachusetts Board of Medical, in other words, the Department of Massachusetts that authorizes doctors and reauthorizes their certification and so forth. And the board says, well, yes, we see from your diploma that you're graduated from the Latvian University Medical School. However, we want you to get from the medical school today a certification, a present-day certification that this certificate is legitimate. And my father says, how in the world do you think I can get communists to sign a paper knowing that we have escaped to America from the communist rule? And so my father says there's no way that they're going to be willing to certify, and the Massachusetts rule says, well, if you can't get an up-to-date certification, you cannot be allowed to practice medicine in the state of Massachusetts. So my father had to leave Massachusetts, and luckily he got a job with the New York State Department of Mental Health and Hygiene as a doctor, and in 2 years afterwards he passed the boards. Now just consider the situation. He graduated in 1933, I believe, from med school in a Latin language. In 1952, he passes the boards in New York State in the English language, having to catch up the medical knowledge that has progressed from 1933 to 1952, and he did it on the first try. So I'm as you see, sometimes, I don't know, you see some of the stuff being passed around. There's pictures here of my father, and that ought to give you an idea, you know, how much he cared and what willpower he had to get the education and get the job like that. So he proceeded to get a full certification as a New York State doctor, and he retired in 1973, I believe. And he moved to Manlius to be near our family. Now, let me go back a little bit to what happened in Latvia after the war. When we went back in 2001, when Sue and I visited, we talked to my cousin who had stayed there, and my cousin was about 4 or 5 years younger, and he described how one day, under Russian rule, under Russian education,